Have you ever wondered what you would do if you were faced with a life or death situation? Today, we're diving into a real and thrilling story that will stir your emotions and keep you hooked until the very end. Imagine a man who had lost everything, but in an act of pure bravery, found a new reason to live by saving the life of a child in the midst of a devastating fire. Get ready to feel the adrenaline and emotion of this journey of redemption and hope. And if you enjoy heartwarming stories that remind us of the power of sacrifice and human kindness, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any episodes. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing you more incredible stories like this one. Let's discover together how this amazing story unfolds. The city lights shone brightly, but for Jacob, they were merely a distant backdrop, a cruel contrast to the darkness enveloping his soul. He was just another lost shadow in the streets of a city that never stopped, a man forgotten by the world, living among the alleys with only his memories and the biting autumn cold for company. Jacob hadn't always been this way. There was a time when he had it all: a beautiful wife, 2 lovely children, and a promising career. He lived in a comfortable house in the suburbs, where the laughter of his children echoed in the mornings and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. But that life shattered into irreparable pieces one fateful morning. It was supposed to be an ordinary family trip. His wife, Claire, was excited to visit her parents in another state, and the kids, Emily and Lucas, couldn't wait to see their grandparents. Jacob, however, was bogged down with work commitments and decided to stay behind. He could never have imagined it would be the last time he would see his family. The plane crashed on the way, and with it, all of Jacob's dreams and hopes. The news hit him like an unrelenting wave, tearing the ground from beneath his feet. He could no longer bear to live in the house that had been the backdrop to so much happiness. Every corner of that place reminded him of the laughter that was now forever silenced. He began to wander the streets, lost in his grief, gradually distancing himself from everything he once knew. Now, he was just a homeless man, a ghost of his former life, wandering aimlessly through the cold streets of a city that didn't see him. The autumn nights were especially cruel, with the icy wind cutting through his skin and the dry leaves whispering sad secrets as they fell around him. It was another such night when Jacob found shelter in a narrow alley, trying to protect himself from the cold with some old newspapers. He watched the nocturnal hustle, the car lights speeding by, the shadows of passers-by, all blending into a silent dance that he no longer understood. As he huddled to warm himself, his thoughts drifted to the past. Emily would be about Julia's age now, he thought. He wondered what his daughter would have been like, what kind of music she liked, what dreams she might have had. But these were unanswered questions, and the pain of not knowing was almost as unbearable as the loss itself. It was then that Jacob noticed something different. The smell of smoke in the air, the distant sound of approaching sirens. He raised his head, his senses alert, and saw black smoke rising from a house a few blocks away. There was an unusual commotion, and he saw firefighters running to the scene, the red and blue lights of their vehicles reflecting on the walls of the surrounding buildings. Something inside him stirred, a premonition, an anxiety he couldn't ignore. He got up, his aching body protesting, but something drove him toward the chaos. He mingled with the small crowd beginning to form outside the house. It was a large, imposing residence, one of many he passed by daily without ever paying much attention. But now, the flames pouring from the windows made it impossible to ignore. Inside the house, Julia, a little girl of just 10 years old, was in her room, unaware of the danger approaching. Her parents were absent. The mother, Emily, was helping at the local church, while the father, a famous businessman, had not yet returned from work. The babysitter, responsible for looking after the girl, was in the living room, trying to calm her nerves with a TV show when the fire started. Panicked, she ran outside, screaming for help, but forgetting the child she had left upstairs. Jacob saw the babysitter rushing out in desperation, but his attention was immediately captured by the windows on the second floor. He realized that someone was still inside. Without thinking twice, he ran toward the door, ignoring the firefighters' shouts, trying to keep him away. To him, The danger didn't matter. All he could think about was the possibility of saving someone who might be like his own daughter. Jacob barely felt the cold as he ran toward the burning house. Each step brought him closer to the thick smoke now enveloping the residence, but the determination in his chest drove him forward. As the firefighters tried to restrain him, he saw the babysitter, gasping and panicked, explaining something to a police officer, her words lost in the chaos around. He didn't need to hear to understand what was happening. Something terrible had unfolded, and someone was still inside. Inside the house, Julia, the daughter of the millionaire businessman, was in her room, wrapped in a bubble of music and carefree. The outside world didn't exist for her, while the soft notes of her favorite music filled the air. But that sense of security dissipated when she finally noticed the acrid smell of smoke, followed by the terrifying sight of dark smoke starting to seep through the cracks of her door. Julia's heart raced, and fear paralyzed her. She quickly took off her headphones, but upon hearing the crackling of flames and the distant sound of screams and sirens, she realized that something terrible was happening. The fire was spreading rapidly, and the girl felt tears welling up in her eyes. She tried to open the door, but was met with a thick cloud of smoke and intense heat that made her recoil, coughing and choking. Outside, Jacob had no time to think about the danger. He remembered his own daughter, Emily, who would be the same age as Julia if she were alive. The thought of losing another child, even if she wasn't his, was unbearable. He forced himself through the wall of smoke and heat emanating from the entrance, feeling his skin burn and his lungs fill with heavy, suffocating air. He passed through the main hallway, where the fire had already taken over the kitchen, spreading through the walls and ceiling. The wooden structure crackled and creaked, threatening to collapse at any moment. Yet, Jacob pressed on, guided by instinct and the desperate desire to save the life that might still be inside. Meanwhile, Julia was trapped in her room, the fire's heat becoming increasingly oppressive. The blaze had blocked her only exit, and panic consumed her. She huddled in the corner of the room, hugging her knees as tears streamed down her face. The smoke made it harder to breathe, and her vision began to blur. Jacob reached the top of the stairs, sweating and his body nearly giving in to exhaustion. The structure threatened to collapse at any moment, and he knew he didn't have much time. With his heart racing uncontrollably, he tried to force open Julia's bedroom door, but it was either locked or jammed. He beat on the door with all the strength he had left, calling for the girl, his voice hoarse from inhaling smoke. There was no answer. A growing sense of despair filled him. The image of his own daughter, trapped in a similar nightmare, haunted him, giving him the strength he needed to continue. With one final effort, he managed to break down the door, almost falling into the room when the wood gave way. There she was, huddled in a corner, her face dirty with soot and her eyes wide with fear. Julia, dazed, could barely comprehend what was happening. The figure that emerged from the smoke was not the hero she had hoped for. It wasn't a firefighter in shiny uniform, but a tattered man with worn clothes and eyes filled with deep sorrow. But in that moment, he was all she had. Jacob ran to her, ignoring the pain in his muscles and the burning in his lungs. He picked her up, feeling her small body tremble with fear and weakness. "It's going to be okay, I promise," he murmured, even though he knew he couldn't make any guarantees. He only knew he needed to get her out of there. The way back wasn't easy. The flames had spread further, licking the walls and threatening to engulf the entire house. With each step, Jacob felt the heat intensify, and the floorboards began to give way under his feet. He couldn't fail, not this time. He wasn't just saving Julia, he was saving the memory of his own daughter. With superhuman effort, he managed to descend the stairs, shielding Julia with his body as debris and pieces of plaster fell around them. The sound of sirens outside seemed distant, muffled by the roar of the flames consuming the house. When he finally reached the front door, Jacob felt a wave of relief. But the danger wasn't over yet. He needed to cross the wall of fire blocking the exit. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Jacob moved through the flames, feeling his skin burn and his lungs screamed for air. But he didn't stop until he was outside, where the cool, fresh night air hit him like a slap. He fell to his knees on the sidewalk, still holding Julia tightly, while firefighters and paramedics rushed to help them. The two were quickly surrounded, and Jacob barely registered the commotion around him. He was exhausted, but a strange peace enveloped him. He had saved Julia. He had saved someone. Even if he couldn't bring his own family back, he had given this child a chance to continue living. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that somehow his daughter was smiling at him, proud of what he had done. Jacob handed Julia over to the paramedics, who quickly began to treat her, and watched as they carried her to the ambulance. He felt tears in his eyes, not from sadness, but from a deep feeling he couldn't describe. He had been a hero, even if just for a moment, and that meant more to him than anything else. Jacob was kneeling on the sidewalk, his hands still trembling, as the cold night breeze tried to soothe the burn on his skin. His lungs burned with each breath, as if they were coated in glowing embers. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The sound of the sirens, once a distant roar, now seemed like a hum in the back of his mind. All he could focus on was the small figure he had just handed over to the paramedics. Julia, the millionaire's daughter, had been unconscious in his arms only moments ago, but she was alive. And at that moment, that was all that mattered to him. As the paramedics worked quickly to stabilize the girl, Jacob leaned against the concrete railing, trying to catch his breath. His body was at its limit, but a feeling of relief mixed with a strange peace filled his heart. He had succeeded. Against all odds, he had pulled the girl from the inferno that consumed that house. He had been a hero, even if just for a fleeting moment. But that moment of peace was interrupted by sounds that, though not unfamiliar, came in a way that made him look towards them with surprise and recognition. A luxury car, a shiny black sedan with tinted windows, was rushing down the street, approaching the scene of chaos and destruction. As it neared, the headlights reflected the still-burning flames of the house, creating a macabre contrast between wealth and tragedy. As the car came to a sudden stop, the doors opened almost simultaneously. A couple emerged, their initially confused expressions quickly giving way to absolute panic as they realized what was happening. It was clear that they hadn't expected to find their home in flames, surrounded by firefighters and police officers. And they certainly hadn't expected to find a ragged and exhausted figure holding the unconscious body of their daughter. The woman, of medium height, with blonde hair elegantly tied in a bun that was now coming undone, ran towards the ambulance where the paramedics were working frantically. "Julia, my daughter!" she screamed, her high-pitched voice overflowing with fear and desperation. Her eyes, wide with horror, focused on the small figure lying on the stretcher. The man, tall and robust, dressed in a suit that spoke of both power and elegance, followed closely behind her, his face reflecting a mixture of shock and disbelief. Jacob watched it all, still too weak to move, as the couple approached their daughter. Their hearts seemed ready to burst from so much emotion. He knew, without anyone needing to say, that these were Julia's parents, the millionaire businessman who had built an empire and the woman who now seemed like the very embodiment of maternal despair. The father, in particular, had an intimidating presence, the kind of man who, in any other situation, would have made Jacob feel insignificant. But at that moment, he felt no fear. The look the man gave him was not one of contempt, but of deep and genuine gratitude. Julia's mother reached the stretcher and grasped her daughter's hand with a fervor bordering on desperation, tears streaming freely down her well-groomed face. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked one of the paramedics, her voice choked with emotion, her eyes fixed on her daughter's pale face. The paramedic nodded firmly, though still busy adjusting the ventilator now covering the girl's face. "She's stable now, but we need to get her to the hospital immediately. She inhaled a lot of smoke and is dehydrated, but she'll be all right." The businessman, beside his wife, couldn't suppress a sigh of relief, though the tension in his shoulders was still evident. He watched as his daughter was taken into the ambulance with tear-filled eyes, but soon turned his attention to Jacob. The man walked over to him. The contrast between the two was stark. Jacob in burned, dirty, and torn clothes, and he in a suit that still exuded wealth. But at that moment, none of these differences mattered. The man knelt beside Jacob, as if the equality of this gesture was necessary to express the depth of his gratitude. "You saved my daughter," the businessman said, his voice trembling slightly, which even surprised him. He was a man accustomed to controlling his emotions, but at that moment, that control was slipping away. "I don't have words to thank you for what you did." Jacob, feeling his strength finally draining from his body, simply shook his head, the gesture tired but full of meaning. "I did what anyone would do," he replied, his voice hoarse and broken, as if each word required a monumental effort. The businessman held Jacob's shoulder firmly, the weight of the gesture communicating more than any words could. "You are not anyone. You are a hero, and I will never forget that." But before Jacob could respond, he felt his legs give way completely. The adrenaline that had sustained his body during the rescue was fading, and exhaustion and injuries began to take their toll. He collapsed to the side, fainting, while the businessman and paramedics quickly supported him. The last thing Jacob heard before losing consciousness was the sound of sirens and the grateful words of the man he had just saved, a stranger just moments before, but now seemingly connected to him by an invisible thread of fate. Jacob woke up in the hospital, the sound of machines and the sterile smell of disinfectant surrounding him. His eyes blinked as he tried to adjust to the bright light above his head. Next to him, a heart monitor emitted a constant beep, while an IV drip slowly delivered fluids into his arm. He blinked again, trying to remember the last events. And then the memory came in waves. The fire, the girl, the desperate parents, and finally, the fainting on the sidewalk. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain ran through his body, forcing him to lie back down. He then realized that his hands were bandaged and that he felt a constant discomfort in his lungs, probably due to the smoke he had inhaled. Jacob sighed, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. It was then that he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. When he opened his eyes, he saw the businessman entering the room, followed by his wife. Both had expressions of fatigue and concern, but there was also something else, a deep gratitude and respect that Jacob could barely comprehend. "How are you feeling?" asked the businessman, his voice low and filled with genuine concern. He pulled up a chair to sit beside Jacob's bed, while his wife stood next to him, her eyes still red from the tears she had likely shed. Jacob tried to smile, but the pain prevented him. I think I'm okay," he replied, his voice still hoarse. "And your daughter? Is she all right?" The woman nodded quickly, tears returning to her eyes. "Yes, thanks to you, she's alive. The doctor said she will recover completely. You saved her. You saved us." The businessman, who had been silent until then, placed his hand over Jacob's, a gesture full of meaning. "We are eternally grateful to you, Jacob. I know you probably think you just did what anyone would do, but what you did was much more than that. You risked your life to save our daughter, and for that, we can never thank you enough." Jacob felt a lump in his throat. The couple's words of gratitude were sincere and touched something deep within him. He had lost everything in his life, his wife, his daughter, his purpose. But at that moment, he had found something new, something that made him feel alive again. Even if just for a brief moment, he had been able to save a life. And for him, that was enough. "I just couldn't stop thinking about my own daughter," Jacob admitted, his voice breaking as he spoke. "She will be the same age as Julia now. And for a moment, it felt like I was saving her too." The woman brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears again, as her husband squeezed Jacob's hand more firmly. "You gave our daughter a second chance," the man said, his voice soft but resolute. "And we want to do the same." The days following the fire passed in a blur for Jacob. The hospital was a place of healing, but also of many thoughts and reflections. He was in the hospital bed, his wounds treated and his health stabilized, but his mind still buzzed with memories and tumultuous emotions. He had saved a life, and it filled him in a way he hadn't experienced since his own life had crumbled years ago. Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the The city was abuzz with news of the unknown hero who had risked his life to save a girl. The story spread like wildfire, no pun intended, and soon Jacob became a household name, not by his choice, but by the nature of his heroic act. The businessman and his wife, upon learning the impact Jacob had made, decided they needed to do more than just express their gratitude verbally. They not only wanted to help Jacob, but also to ensure he knew that his life was invaluable to them and to the world around him. They sought to ensure that he could at least receive dignified treatment and the opportunity to rebuild his life if he so wished. Jacob was deep in thought when the door to his room opened, revealing the businessman and his wife. Both looked visibly more relaxed than during their last visit, and a sincere smile lit up the faces that had once been filled with concern and panic. "How are you feeling today, Jacob?" the businessman asked, pulling up a chair to sit beside Jacob's bed. The woman, still with her eyes gently swollen, took a seat next to him, watching Jacob with a look of concern and empathy. "Better, thank you," Jacob replied, trying to force a smile. His voice still had a rough edge, and he realized that recovery would not be as swift as he would like, but he was in a more calm and reflective state of mind. The businessman cleared his throat, clearly struggling with his words. "We want to discuss a few things with you. First and foremost, we want to make sure you know that you're not alone." Jacob furrowed his brow, confused. "What do you mean by that?" "Well," the businessman began, "we know you've been through an incredibly tough time, and we want to help in any way we can. Of course, you performed an act of courage that few people would have the capacity to do, and we want to give back, truly." Jacob felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of him was wary. He was so used to feeling invisible, forgettable, that the idea of receiving help seemed surreal. But another part of him, one that had long since stopped allowing itself to dream, was cautiously hopeful. "I really appreciate that. But what exactly are you offering?" Jacob asked, his eyes searching for sincerity in their faces. The woman, who had remained silent until now, spoke with a gentle voice. "We would like to help you find a place to live, a place where you can feel safe and comfortable. Additionally, we would like to provide financial and medical support to ensure that all your basic needs are covered while you recover." Jacob felt the weight of these words and closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the enormity of the offer. He didn't want to seem ungrateful, but he also struggled to accept something so generous. He had spent years fighting to stay afloat, and now the chance for a better life was within reach, but he wondered if he truly deserved it. I don't know what to say," Jacob murmured, his voice heavy with emotion. "I never thought anyone could offer me something like this. I've always been alone." The businessman placed a comforting hand on Jacob's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore. You did something incredible, and we want you to know that there are people who care about you. It's not just about giving back. It's about recognizing the dignity and value you have, no matter where you've been or what you've been through." Jacob looked at the wife, who offered him a gentle smile. "We understand that accepting help can be difficult, but we want you to know that we're here for you. We'll make sure you have what you need to start over. And don't worry about anything right now. Just focus on getting better." The offer was clear, and the help was genuine. Jacob felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The possibility of a better future was real, but the idea of starting over, of accepting help and rebuilding his life, was daunting. His mind was filled with doubts, but he also felt a spark of hope for the first time in a long time. As the days went by, Jacob received the necessary treatment and began to recover. The financial and medical support provided by Julia's parents helped ease the burden of his immediate concerns. He was under the care of skilled doctors and received the emotional support needed to cope with the physical and psychological trauma. In one of the following visits, the businessman and his wife brought a small box for Jacob. Inside the box was a set of new, clean clothes, along with a handwritten letter. The letter was a heartfelt expression of gratitude and respect. They expressed their admiration for Jacob's courage and resilience, and reiterated their desire to help him have a new chance at life. They also included information about a temporary apartment and a plan for ongoing support to help him transition to a better life. Jacob read the letter with tears in his eyes. He had been through a period where nothing seemed to matter, but now, thanks to the generosity of those he had helped, he was beginning to see a new perspective. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy and that the pain of the past still weighed on him, but the possibility of a better future gave him hope. He looked at the businessman and his wife with a deeply grateful expression. "I don't know how to thank you enough," he said, his voice laden with emotion. "All I can say is that I'll do my best to show that your help was well placed. I'll use this new chance to do something good." The businessman smiled, a smile both of relief and pride. "We're glad to be able to help. And remember, it's not just about what you can do to give back. It's about what you do with the opportunity you've been given." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Jacob looked out the hospital window and saw the horizon with a new perspective. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel. Now, with the support of Julia's parents and the promise of a new chance, Jacob was ready to face the next chapter of his life, determined to make the most of the opportunity he had been given and to rebuild his future. But the journey of recovery and transformation was just beginning, and he was about to discover that sometimes the greatest challenge can be accepting and adapting to a life he had nearly forgotten what it would be like. The day was fresh and sunny when Jacob, still recovering, was discharged from the hospital. He was different, not just physically, with the wounds and burns starting to heal, but also mentally. There was a clarity in his eyes that had been missing before, a sense of purpose that was slowly taking root in his heart. Julia's parents were waiting for him in the hospital reception. The businessman, always impeccably dressed, and his wife, with a warm smile, gave Jacob a hug that seemed full of gratitude and support. They were no longer just acquaintances. They were now friends and, in a way, almost family. "Ready to go?" the businessman asked, a firm hand on Jacob's shoulder. Jacob nodded. Although he was still a bit hesitant about the direction his life would take, he knew he was no longer alone. The family he had saved was determined to ensure he had the chance to rebuild his life. The car waiting outside was a sleek black SUV that reflected the sunlight almost blindingly. Jacob was guided to the back seat while the businessman took the wheel and his wife sat beside him. The ride was smooth, filled with light conversation about how he was feeling and what the next steps in his treatment would be. But there was something else on Jacob's mind, something he hadn't yet voiced, and it involved Julia. Since the incident, Jacob had only seen the little girl once, fleetingly, while she was still being treated in the emergency room. But something about that child had touched his heart in a way he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way she looked at him with those large brown eyes, full of confusion and fear. Or maybe it was simply the protective instinct he felt seeing her so vulnerable. Either way, he felt he needed to see her again to make sure she was okay. "How is Julia?" Jacob finally asked, breaking the silence in the car. The businessman's wife turned to him, surprised and touched by his concern. "She's doing well, thanks to you. Actually, she talks about you all the time. I think you've become something of a hero to her." Jacob felt a warmth in his chest at hearing this. Being seen as a hero by someone, especially by an innocent child, was something he had never imagined for himself. "She wants to see you, you know," the woman continued. "She's been asking about you every day. Do you think you're ready to meet her?" Jacob hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Yes, I think so." The drive continued for a few more minutes until the car stopped in front of a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't the mansion he had known before the fire, but a temporary house the family had rented while sorting out the rebuilding of their original home. The place looked welcoming, with a well-kept garden and colorful flowers lining the entrance. Jacob stepped out of the car, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. There was a peace in the place, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He was guided by the businessman's wife to the entrance, where a bright white door awaited. Upon entering the house, Jacob was immediately greeted by the soft sound of classical music playing in the background and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. The house was simply but elegantly decorated, with furniture that spoke of comfort and a timeless sense of style. And then he saw her, sitting in an armchair in the living room, a fairy tale book in her hands, was Julia. She looked much better than the last time he had seen her. Her cheeks had regained their healthy pink color, and her eyes, once so full of fear, now shone with curiosity and joy. Upon noticing Jacob at the entrance, she dropped the book and ran towards him with an energy only a child could have. "Jacob," she exclaimed, her voice filled with happiness and admiration. He crouched down, opening his arms for her, and she enveloped him in a tight hug. Jacob felt a lump in his throat, but managed to maintain his composure as he hugged her back. That moment, that simple embrace, meant more to him than any words could express. "Are you okay, Julia?" he asked, his voice soft and full of affection. She pulled back a little, still holding his hands, and nodded vigorously. "Yes, and it's all thanks to you. Mommy and Daddy said you saved me. You're my hero." Jacob smiled, feeling the weight of responsibility and the warmth of recognition in her words. "I'm glad you're okay, Julia. You were very brave." She looked at him with eyes full of admiration. "I want to be strong like you one day." Jacob laughed softly. "You already are strong and very brave." The businessman and his wife watched the scene from the side, their faces full of pride and emotion. To them, Jacob was not just the man who had saved their daughter. He was now an important part of their lives, someone they owed more than they could express. "Julia has talked about you every day," Jacob said, the businessman's wife. "She was eager to meet you, and so were we. You've brought something very special into our lives." Jacob felt humbled by her words. He, who had felt like an outcast for so long, someone without a place in the world, was now seen as a hero, as someone worthy of respect and gratitude. That recognition was something he didn't know how to handle, but accepted with the same courage he had shown during the fire. The afternoon unfolded with light conversations, laughter, and a growing sense of belonging. Jacob was treated as an honored guest, but also as an old friend. He spent hours talking with Julia, listening to her stories, and laughing at her innocent jokes. There was something healing in that moment, something that slowly began to mend the invisible wounds he carried inside. As the sun began to set, casting golden and pink hues across the sky, Jacob knew that something important had changed. It wasn't just the fact that he had saved a life, but the way he had reconnected with the world and with other people. As night fell, Jacob was taken back to the temporary apartment the parents of Julia had arranged for him. There alone, he reflected on the day. The feeling of belonging was still present, and he realized that for the first time in a long time, he was not just surviving, he was beginning to live again. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob's life began to follow a different rhythm. He had settled into his new routine, helping Julia's family in various ways, from simple tasks to more complex issues involving emotional and logistical recovery after the fire. But amid all the rebuilding and normalization, something profound was transforming inside him. Julia and Jacob had become inseparable. The little girl saw in him not just a hero but a father figure, someone she could fully trust. Jacob, in turn, found in Julia a kind of redemption, an opportunity to heal the wounds he had carried since early adulthood. He loved her as if she were his own daughter, and that sense of protective and paternal love was something he had never experienced before. However, as much as their relationship was strengthening, something was troubling Jacob. A weight, a secret he felt the need to share, but feared the consequences. The gratitude of Julia's parents was overwhelming, and the fear of losing what he had gained was real. But fate, as always, had other plans. It was a cold night, the first since winter had fully set in. The snow blanketed the ground in a thick white layer, transforming the landscape into a scene of tranquility. Jacob was sitting on the couch, watching the flames dance in the fireplace, when the businessman approached. The man looked more serious than usual, which immediately alerted Jacob. "Jacob, can we talk?" the businessman asked, his voice gentle but laden with seriousness. Jacob nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. They moved to the living room, where they sat in opposite chairs, creating a palpable tension in the air. "There's something I need to tell you," the businessman began. "Something about the day you saved Julia." Jacob remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "We discovered, through subsequent investigations, that the fire was not accidental. It was orchestrated." Jacob's heart raced. "What do you mean?" The businessman sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of weariness. Someone had a vested interest in harming us, and apparently you were involved, even if unwittingly. Jacob felt a chilling wave sweep over him. He knew what the businessman was referring to, but he never imagined that the past would resurface in such a cruel way. Before responding, he swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know they would do this. I was only paid to gather information about your company, to observe, but I never thought it would come to this. The businessman remained silent, his eyes fixed on Jacob. We know that now, Jacob, but at the time, you were just a shadow, someone we couldn't trust. That's why we started investigating, and we eventually uncovered the truth. You were used, manipulated, and that's clear to us. But the fact that you redeemed yourself by risking your own life to save my daughter was what changed our opinion. Jacob felt the weight of guilt come crashing down on him like an avalanche. He had been a pawn in a much larger game than he could have imagined, and now his entire new life was threatened by this revelation. Why didn't you tell me before? He asked, his voice trembling. Because we needed to be sure. We needed to be certain that you truly didn't know what was happening. And then, when we saw how dedicated you were to us, how you cared for Julia, we knew you were more than your past. You became someone we can call a friend, family. Jacob felt tears welling up in his eyes. He had spent so much time hating himself for what he had done, for being part of something so dark, and now, hearing those words of forgiveness and acceptance was more than he could bear. I'm so sorry, he said, finally letting the tears flow down his face. I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to survive. The businessman stood up and walked over to Jacob, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. You didn't just survive, Jacob. You lived. And now, you have a new chance, a new life. We accept you as part of our family, and we want you to know that we're here for you, just as you were there for us. Jacob looked at the man who, not long ago, he would have seen as an enemy, and realized there was something greater at stake now. He had found a new family, a new purpose, and was willing to do whatever it took to earn this new chance. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Jacob went to Julia's room. The little girl was sleeping deeply, her breath soft and rhythmic. He knelt by her bed and took her small hand. I love you, Julia, he whispered, feeling the weight of his words. I will spend the rest of my life protecting you, caring for you, loving you as if you were my own daughter. He then stood up and moved toward the door, but before he could leave, something surprising happened. Julia opened her eyes, half asleep, and whispered, I love you too, Jacob. Forever. Those words echoed in Jacob's heart like a hymn of redemption. He knew his past couldn't be erased, but he also knew he had the power to shape his future. And with this new family by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges came. Jacob had indeed become a hero, not the kind that saves the world from villains, but the kind who saves himself from his own darkness and finds light in unexpected places. And to Julia, he would always be the man who saved her from the fire, but also the one who brought warmth and love into her life. The end of Jacob and Julia's story was a new beginning. The house destroyed by the fire was rebuilt, but more importantly, the lives devastated by the circumstances found a new hope, a new reason to move forward. And so, with the snow gently falling outside, the family that Jacob had saved found their own form of salvation. And Jacob, who had once lost everything, now had everything he had ever wanted: a family, a purpose, and above all, a place to belong.